There's no question in my mind there's been some phenomenal cover-up. Axel Rudakubana, we had these pictures of this guy as a child. Are we seriously meant to think that there are no pictures of this guy for the past 10 years? There are now 5 what I would call Islamist MPs.
They have a political foothold.
There was also an organisation called Muslim Vote. Then you have, for example, 32% wanting Sharia law. That does worry me hugely, and I think it worries most people, actually. Well, there is obviously a fear of actually even talking about this. Can you imagine a broadcaster doing a weekly programme on the effects of migration or what's happening with the boats this week? How do you define Islamophobia? Which is a made-up term anyway. There used to be an expression in this country which everyone used, I don't care, it's a free country. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Never hear it.
That's a really good point.
Never hear it.
Hello, fellow heretics. Thanks so much for watching this content. I couldn't do it without you. I just wanted to quickly ask you to please like and subscribe. I see that only a tiny percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed to the channel. Please click subscribe because it will boost this content to the rest of the world and will also help me to continue convincing the best guests to grace the heretics stage. Is it possible that the UK could suffer the kind of fate suffered by Lebanon and Iran and I think Turkey right now, where the Islamic population grows to an extent where they have a political foothold?
Well, they already have got a political foothold. I mean, one of the interesting things is that in the last election, people were, quite rightly drawing attention to the size of the Labour majority, to the fact that Reform got 5 MPs. But there are now, if you include Jeremy Corbyn, there are now 5, what I would call Islamist MPs. I mean, basically sectarians. And these are people who are pro-Gaza. That's how they got elected. They're independent. They formed a little group. Okay, it happens to be Gaza now, but, who knows in the future, it might be some other issue. But so it's already there. And yet this has had very little comment about it. There was also an organisation called Muslim Vote, the Muslim Vote, very, very confident just after the election, look what we've done, to get the Muslim vote out. So in other words, purely on the basis of being Muslim. So I think that we're seeing the beginnings of it. We've had it in the general election. So that does worry me hugely, and I think it worries most people, actually. But such has been the kind of approach by government, by media to this, that obviously people feel extremely inhibited, about criticizing or actually protesting about it. Also, the thing that does worry me a lot is that, the actual attitudes of a wider Muslim community, which is, people say, oh, you mustn't sort of, you can't tar all Muslims with the same brush. Of course, no one is saying that you do that. But when you look on a whole series of issues, whether it's position of women, position of gay people, free speech, Sharia law, it should worry everybody.
Do we know what kind of percentage of British Muslims?
Well, there are many surveys that have basically been done, obviously, over the past few years. Most recently, the Henry Jackson Society did one. And it showed, for example, this very alarming statistic that basically the majority of Muslims in this country just didn't believe that Hamas had raped and murdered in Israel. Something like 3/4, a huge number. And then underneath that, then you have, for example, 32% wanting Sharia law.
Wow.
We prefer Sharia law. Now, I'm not a mathematical wizard, Andrew, but, what, 4 million Muslims, 32%, what is that? That's a sizable number of people. Sizable number of people wanting Sharia law. About 52% thought that there should never, ever be any depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, for example. What is very alarming about all of these kind of figures is that there's no pushback on them from, you know, if you like, our establishment or even our established political parties, actually. There's no real pushback. But also it is that the younger the younger that you get, the more radical they are. Now, so like the 18 to 32, group of Muslims, young Muslims, and that's going to have huge, impact on the whole feel and quality of our society, And I think that there is an absolute, well, there is obviously a fear of actually even talking about this, because you have this kind of view that, oh, well, look, actually, majority of, Muslims are, obviously peace-loving and decent and all of that, and they're very, very worried about extremism. Yes, that might well be true, but I'm also worried about those kind of attitudes, which in any other context would be called hard-right bigoted.
Yeah.
What also worries me, and I mean, I alluded to it a bit before when we were talking about the arts and things, is this sort of idea that you cannot, for example, depict the Prophet Muhammad. So we've now got a teacher who will probably remain in hiding in Batley in Yorkshire, probably remain in hiding for maybe all his life, for all we know. No one's coming to his aid. No politicians have stood up, from the main parties, if you like, come to his aid and support.
No, because they don't want to get killed themselves.
Well, quite. And basically, this is someone who just simply showed cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad to his pupils. I think he was actually teaching them about, blasphemy and as a subject. But therefore, what we now have is a kind of unofficial blasphemy law.
Yeah, yeah. And I've seen people as well defending or saying, well, he shouldn't have said that then, should he?
I mean, I saw someone recently on GB News.
Yes, that was what I saw.
Very same thing. And it sort of is just, it leaves you speechless. Yeah. They would happily, they will happily jettison free speech. They will blame effectively the victim, which this guy was doing on GB News. He shouldn't have said it, right? So basically, people internalize this. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. They internalize it. They self-censor. And I think that the threats to free speech that we're seeing, we might even talk about, when it comes to, all sorts of other areas, hate speech laws and everything, that is bad. But also this kind of internalized censorship when it comes to possibly offending sensibilities of certain religious groups. You might know as well, and there's this rather controversial definition. It was passed by an all-party parliamentary group of what is Islamophobia. How do you define Islamophobia? Which is a made-up term anyway.
Obviously,
it's a pretty nonsense term.
Yeah.
But they said in this definition, Islamophobia is rooted in racism and, excuse me if I get the actual words wrong, but it's basically, and it's expressed as hatred of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Now, that is a blasphemy law, that thing. When it comes to free speech, how would that actually work? So, for example, if you are against the wearing of the burqa, that could actually now come under that definition. It would be seen as an expression of Muslimness, would it not? How would you, for example, criticize or try to bring up, for example, the grooming gang scandal? All of these things. That's before you get to the Quran. Now, this definition has been adopted by the Labour Party, I think the Lib Dems, most parties except for the Tory party. And it's not yet enshrined in any law here, but it has been adopted by local councils, for example, all around the country. That is a direct attack on free speech. I see no other way of describing it.
I also take issue with this idea of Islamophobia being an issue with Muslimness. That ness implies that anybody who they might accuse of being Islamophobic has an issue with a family, say, who might even be quite secular, but has some Muslim-ishness. And that's such an unfair portrayal of those of us who are speaking out against some of the evils of the ideology itself. I don't have an issue with somebody who's somehow related to Islam or is from a Muslim family or whatever it is. It's people not adapting to British values.
Well, no, but the thing is that it's totally illiterate. I mean, because Islam is, I mean, how many times have people said this, you know, in these interviews? Islam is an ideology. It's a belief system, right? It's a belief system, such as Christianity or many others, Marxism. And it's not about race. But this actual definition conflates those two.
Yeah.
It says Islamophobia is rooted in racism. So basically it's a catch-all. So your average person, you know, everyday life, they might actually think, well, I'm not sure whether I can say that anymore or whether I should say that or mention this, so I'll just be quiet. I'll just stay quiet. And I think that, you know, we talk, or it's often mentioned, there's this thing called a chilling effect that happens with free speech. Well, we're past this chilling effect stage, I think. I mean, it's happened. So people are very careful about what they say, even privately. Actually.
Well, going back to that Paul Graham issue and you going to America, one of the things he says in that article about what we can't say is if you took two people, but one of them went off and lived some sort of Conrad's life in Africa and then off to the Middle East and then all these different kinds of things, went to different places, different experiences, and then came back, the person who had just stayed where they are might find a lot more things to be taboo. What they consider taboo would be there'd be a low entry point for that, because they're used to a very, very particular set of circumstances. You came back from living abroad in a country that has much freer free speech, and you came back and suddenly you can see it in a way that I think a lot of people who are just going about their day-to-day business, don't want to cause a fuss. It just seems normal here, doesn't it? Yeah. But you came back and you went, bloody hell.
Yes.
That's how Americans view us right now.
Well, yes. Americans really can't believe what's happening. That also works. Your analogy there, coming back from travels, it also works in terms of age. You know, for people, those of us who are old enough to remember, you know, when in fact things were far freer, you know.
Yeah.
And of course, that whole, you know, the time before, if you like, let's say anything up to the 1990s, the early part of this century, that has to be kind of, you know, it has to be painted as entirely wrong. You know, that, okay, you say free to be what? Free to be racist, free to be sexist, all of these things. No, actually, just freedom to actually, first of all, have views that you believe and that can be argued with and disagreed with. That now no longer happens. I mean, I think in that article he mentions a sort of 16-year-old girl,
that's right,
doesn't he? And, you know, in this country. Well, the 16-year-olds are in charge, actually, effectively.
That's what's happened, isn't it?
Yes, because, I mean, essentially it is a kind of juvenile thing, because with adulthood comes, you know, nuance. It should come anyway. Nuance, it should, you know, a diversity of experience should bring subtlety of thought, all of those things. What now we have now is a kind of, well, I always think of the Midwich Cuckoos, you know, that book of the kids who are all kind of super brainy. But the fact is these aren't super brainy, but they were sort of in charge, if you like. You know, there's no question that a whole field of society is far more constricted than it was 20 years ago.
I think if there were...
I just want to add one more thing to that.
Yeah.
Now, there are some people who say that the reason for that is that actually, because we have multiculturalism, there was a time, you know, when basically, like, again, 20, 25 years ago, where people, I remember hearing it, people say, well, actually, you know, if we are going to have a successful multicultural society, we are going to have certain curbs on certain types of speech. People would say it very reasonably, and perhaps they didn't sort of realize what we were going to end up with. But they were sort of, in some ways, they were right, that the only way the situation in Britain can now actually go on is if basically people stop, from actually saying certain things.
Which is quite extraordinary that we've gotten to this point.
But we see it being played out, do we not, every day?
Well, people being arrested now for Twitter posts and things like that. One of the things I've realized recently about my in-laws, they're Argentinian. They lived through a dictatorship. And it's a funny thing, when you're just on holiday together with the in-laws, you don't think about it, but they actually grew up in the military junta. Which was horrific. And people were just taken from their homes because they were suspected, put in a helicopter and thrown into the sea. Horrible thing to happen. But something that they all know is an expression, which is algo habrán hecho. Yeah, algo habrán hecho, which means they will have done something. That's why they were thrown off. People know that now in Argentina because it's so chilling, that expression.
Yes.
They will have done something. And I think that's where we're moving to now. When I tell people, oh yeah, but this woman was just arrested for Twitter posts. She called the migrants, what did she call them, a swamp or something? Or
tramps or something.
Tramps or something like that, which is a horrible thing to say. But again, they will have done something. Well, yes, she did, but not worthy of being arrested. But people just feel like as long as I'm careful and don't say such offensive things, I won't be arrested.
Do you remember that there used to be an expression in this country which everyone used in almost every sort of situation? I don't care, it's a free country. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Do what you like, mate, it's a free country.
Yeah.
Never hear it.
That's a really good point.
You never hear it.
It was a bit asinine, wasn't it? Because it was often used to sort of like someone could slap someone. I don't care, mate, free country, slap you if I want.
But it was kind of one of those expressions that you just don't hear anymore because it increasingly doesn't feel free.
And it feels like a slur in itself to suggest that a free country, if somebody's saying it's a free country, will be immediately labelled right-wing, which is extraordinary.
They sort of managed to make free speech a kind of right-wing thing. I mean, I think that, as I said, people are wising up to this. And you mentioned the Twitter posts and things and people being put in prison. We saw that recently with the kind of civil disorder, obviously people being put in jail, within the twinkling of an eye, quite harsh sentences. One man since died in jail.
Yeah. Took his life in custody.
Yes, Peter Lynch. But what was interesting about that was that it was the speed of it, and also the Home Office, I remember, put out its own tweet, its own announcement, and it was saying 1,000 arrests for for people who've taken part in this. Riots is, I think, too strong a word almost, but it is civil disorder. 1,000 arrests. And it said in the tweet, these criminals will be dealt with harshly. And you often thought, these people haven't even been charged yet. And you're calling them criminals? We're sort of sitting here being very careful about sub judice laws and all the rest of it. And you make some kind of announcement like that. So you obviously don't care about it, So it is people are seeing this now. It's being played out. Two-tier policing is being played out in front of them. So, that can, unfortunately, only be a good thing, that's the way they see it.
Did you see what Nigel Farage was saying about... so what's the name of this individual who's being accused of doing the stabbing?
It's Axel Rudakubana.
Yes. And so Farage said, I believe he said there's a lot that he knows about this.
That's right.
That would shock people that he can't currently say.
Yes. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff swirling about on social media. We're not meant to say anything, something that doesn't exist in America, of course, but we have these sub judice laws. There's no question in my mind there's been some phenomenal cover-up. I talked about this on the channel recently that, I mean, even from the very beginning, we had these pictures of this guy as a child. Are we seriously meant to think that there are no pictures of this guy for the past 10 years? I mean, we had these kind of sweet childhood pictures being constantly put out. They were the only ones there. Where was the mugshot? Everyone has a mugshot when they're arrested.
Yeah. Trump had one.
Didn't he? Where was it?
Did Trump have one? I feel like I've seen a Trump one.
Well, yes, and certainly the people who were put in jail after that civil disorder this summer, they certainly had mugshots and they will put out straight away. This guy hasn't had them. All we've had these sketches in court where he's holding up his sweater in the drawings, you know. Now, why is that even being allowed? Or people aren't allowed to cover their faces in court.
For court sketches.
So everything about it feels very, very bad, as Nigel pointed out, and other people have pointed out. You know, there's something possibly really big about this. But of course, we actually have to make sure that we monitor what happens, because there's a rumor now that they will try to move the next court appearance, the trial, even further down the road. I mean, I suppose the idea behind that will be that people will kind of forget eventually.
Which I don't think will happen, because the anger in this country is at boiling point right now.
Yes.
And we were accused by, at the time, the new Prime Minister, of all being far right. Meanwhile, the far left were out on the street calling for Antifa. I say it wrong every time. Which one is it? Antifa? Antifada?
Oh, yes, Antifada.
Not Antifa, Antifada.
Yes.
Funny that those two are the similar names.
Yes, of course. There was the thing about those, what happened with those mini riots or whatever, protests, no sense of sympathy whatsoever for why people might actually be out on the streets. What happens whenever we have a riot in this country, like if you think of 2011 in London and other riots, I mean, going right back in the 1980s, Brixton riots, Toxteth riots, I remember, people condemned the violence, rightly, as we all do. No one's, basically trying to justify that. But there was always this sort of thought, what is behind this? Let's look at what's behind. Why? Why do people feel?
George Floyd, for example.
Yes.
And they didn't even condemn his violence and his issues.
Exactly. Why do people feel this way? We should address the underlying issues. How many times have you heard that? Yeah. Except for this one. There was no attempt to actually get to what was behind it. Nothing. It was just coming down on it like a hammer. No one said, well, what's actually behind it? What's the anger? And we have our media, unfortunately, on the whole, to thank for that, because they don't go into it. They just immediately take the sort of same line as the Prime Minister did, which is that these are just kind of far-right thugs.
Even the Daily Mail.
Yes, I think they're all becoming much of a muchness now, Andrew, really. I mean, including the Mail.
It's sort of them against us social media influencers.
Yes. I mean, with all my reservations about Twitter and all my reservations about social media generally, I have to thank God for it, actually, in a way, because it's the only way, in fact, you're going to get certain kinds of information now. But I just think it was very telling that there was no allowances made whatsoever for the reasons that people might have just gone a bit wild, which they did. As I said, no one is saying what they did was right if they kind of set light to put it. We have to say that, of course, but you should at least try to address the underlying issues. There was no attempt, and there is none attempt.
It's just a very angry population right now. So I suppose we can't do anything but vaguely speculate, because there is a trial and we have to be very careful. At the same time, the mainstream newspapers have put out, I believe I'm right in saying this, that the stabber was related to Islam, had the Islam propaganda and all those things. So I believe we can say that.
We had a manual, we believe, of the trial is not being treated as a terrorist trial at the moment, but there is one charge which relates to this manual of Al-Qaeda activity, which he possessed. But I think that the production of ricin, that charge is being brought under another act. So it's a little bit complicated.
But a lot of us were told that we were conspiracy theorists, racists, and all of these, the far right, even for thinking this might have been an Islamic or Islamic in nature. And it turns out that many of us were right. And there needs to be an apology, doesn't there, from Keir Starmer?
Oh, well, are you kidding? I mean, of course there's not going to be.
And he must have known this some time ago, that this was Islamic in nature.
Well, that's the other thing, is that basically with something as desperately tragic as this murder of 3 young girls, and indeed 8 more injured at that time, there would, at the highest level, surely, the Home Secretary, Prime Minister, would know about that case straight away. I mean, they would have gone, he would have had his house or his family home or whatever searched very, very quickly. They would presumably have known about this very, very quickly. But when did we even learn about these new charges? It was what, about a month ago?
Yeah.
3.5 months,
By which time many of the far-right, so-called far-right protesters have already been either arrested or died in custody. That was much quicker. I understand this might be a more complex case and they've got to actually, do this right. And that's no easy thing with all of us shouting. I understand that as well. But there does seem to be some sort of cover-up. Do you know what in nature? I suppose we can't even really say.
No, I mean, just for the reasons I've just said, looking at it, they must have known very early on, like within 24 or 48 hours, they must have searched his house high and low. They must have found those things. Why wait, 3 months before you actually, announce those charges? So something very bad has gone on. And then, of course, in the middle of that, as you say, they're actually quite happily locking up people for, saying things on Facebook or whatever it was they said.
Is there any reason to be positive, optimistic?
How do you mean? What's that?
About the future of this country?
Oh, yes, there is. Andrew, I mean, I wouldn't do what I do if I weren't basically optimistic. No question about it. It's tough. I mean, people are angry and also very sad, actually, at the speed with which their society is changing. You can sort of feel it. It's tangible, I feel, in here. But then something happens. So, for example, you might say, how is that related to us? Well, in an odd way, it is. The election of Trump in America, not just the election, but landslide, that gives one enormous hope. Because just on one level, it's a body blow to the kind of people who have brought these kind of situations in our country about. It's a kind of psychological body blow. And I say that because when Trump originally won, back in 2016, whatever it was, he could be sort of written off, right? He could be written off as maybe an opportunist or whatever, the usual thing they say. This time, they couldn't write the whole thing off, because basically everyone knew what they were getting, and he was, had the most extraordinary vote. So now they've been reduced to insulting not Trump, but the people, right? It's made it very clear. You've had some of your most kind of liberal or lefty commentators, James O'Brien, people like this, saying, I can only think that people don't care about liberal values, this sort of thing. You should think, yeah, that's right. Actually, without meaning to, you're right. People care, actually, of course they do, about liberal values. But the fact is that you're now reduced to insulting the people who voted for him. But the fact is that if people can get through, in the case of America, a mainstream media which is solidly Democrat, and also Hollywood, as we talked about before, solidly Democrat, talking about this, virtual Nazi, I think they called him, didn't they? Mm-hmm. And they vote for him because they see, that he's actually going to stand up for the things that they care about. That gives me enormous hope for this country too. Tell me a bit about your background and your own channel. My background. Well, first of all, I'm a Londoner, born and bred, moved out a few years ago to Windsor. But before I started the New Culture Forum, which was, 2006, I was pretty much solidly in the media for about 15 years, as I know you were, like making TV programs, documentaries, mainstream media. And then after that, print journalism, mostly arts and cultural criticism, film reviewing, theatre reviewing. I was that kind of, not a lovey, I wasn't, but I was part of that sort of thing. Started the New Culture Forum as a think tank in 2006. And since then, we've sort of, in many respects, sort of burst our banks, in the sense that we still do those things that you do, like you publish books and you have campaigns and things and events. but we've become more of a political organization now. Obviously, we have our channel, which we were one of the first sort of political people to do it here just before lockdown. And it's a huge success for us. So I think we're pretty much on the same kind of subs level at the moment, I think, Andrew, with you. And it's been great. But I think obviously it was born out of a time, the NCF channel, when you're looking at the mainstream media and you thought, any kind of message that we want to get out, it's getting harder and harder. It's becoming more and more constricted. We've just got to make our own means of communication. And now, of course, everyone's doing that pretty much as a matter of course. But we sort of thought, well, actually, they're not, when it comes to people, if you like, broadly on the right or centre-right, call it what you want, it was getting more and more difficult. So therefore, you've got to do it yourself. And so I suppose, thank God for YouTube in that way.
Is that why new culture? Because the culture, especially having worked in the media yourself, you were seeing that it was very much a monopoly on,
Yes, it was. And I mean, when we started out, there was no question that you just sensed some things were already happening. So what you could really address, what you could talk about, it was sort of getting narrower even then. I'd been living in America for 5 years before that. And when I came back, I didn't like the way the country seemed to be going. And I also sort of found that at that time, if I remember around that time, there were the same kind of questions which we're getting now, which was about sort of freedom of speech, the effect of Islam on freedom of speech, all of those things. And the arts were gradually sort of, trimming what they would do. So, yes, I think it was around that time that this is something we actually have to really do. We've got to sort of start making our own stuff.
It's really interesting that it was that you went away to America and came back here.
Yes.
There's a great article by Paul Graham, which I keep referencing. It's something like what you can't say or something.
That's it, yes.
Have you read that?
Yes, I have. It's the one, where he goes into some sort of depth, doesn't he, about how you actually work it out. What you can and cannot say is obviously getting, is it better than 10 years ago? Well, by virtue of the fact that we can talk, it is, I suppose, better. But just don't go to the mainstream media for it anymore, And also, the arts, which is what I used to write about and I make programs about, forget it. I mean, the arts generally, theatre, drama, visual arts, they are like the kind of visual aid unit, I'd say, for the political class.
Which is so sad because art is supposed to be about the total opposite.
Well, it's meant to be like the beacon of free expression. It's meant to be, obviously, at the very, cutting edge of free speech. They seem to have entirely lost that. And in fact, this is actually, illustrated by the sort of people who are now in the arts, where, they broadly sort of have the same attitudes and same views as each other. And so it's, you will not see, for example, a drama on the BBC or a play in the West End, which, for example, is critical of multiculturalism in some ways, or, for example, looks at the effects of mass migration on a town in England, for example. You just, unless it's going to be very, very pro-immigration and, basically negative about the inhabitants, you won't see it. And so all the messaging now in the arts, and that was already happening, around about, beginning of this century now.
Well, that's when he wrote that article, Paul Graham, isn't it? And he said even then it was happening a little bit. I suppose it's all a pendulum and there's authoritarianism. We were talking a little bit before off camera about Stacey Dooley because she made this documentary about Islam in Luton, her home. It was called something like My Hometown or something.
Yes.
And it was shocking to watch. I don't know if you recall, there's just people in burqas just like screaming at her for dressing the way she does, which was very, professional. Yeah. And we were thinking, could that be made today, 13 years later?
I doubt it. We know it wouldn't be.
For the BBC.
It wouldn't be, BBC, of course, we particularly go after simply because, Well, they set the general agenda of the media, and they're the leaders, if you like. But also, we have to pay for it. But aren't they all pretty much the same now? I mean, ITV's pretty left. I remember Sky TV, Sky News. They did this program. Do you remember about climate change? It was a weekly, sort of update on climate change. It was they took it off because no one was watching it. I mean, who would want to watch it? But, that was sort of quite acceptable to do. Of course, it was like why we should really be, keeping you informed of what's happening with climate change. Can you imagine, a broadcaster doing a weekly program on the effects of migration, for example, or what's happening in migration this week, or what's happening with the boats this week? It would get a lot of views. It's just, inconceivable.
Does that suggest that the ideology is more powerful than their own interests because they want a lot of views? Surely.
Well, you would think, wouldn't you? I mean, it's a bit like when people say, we want to get people into the theatre. That's one of the oldest ones in the book. We want to get more working class people into the theatre and, and have a wider audience. And you sort of think, well, why don't you start making plays, for example, that actually might speak to the sort of things that they experience every day? Why? That's the way to get it. And it's the same for television, I think. I think that what it is a kind of groupthink, which basically believes a certain thing. So it wouldn't occur to them to actually do something which is in any way critical of those views. It just wouldn't occur to them. And they wouldn't even see it, many of them, I think, as a kind of political thing. They just think it's the way that good people think.
I wonder, I've been thinking about this, obviously there are issues with what we do because we don't have quite the same level of checks that someone like the BBC does. Yeah. We don't have necessarily a team of lawyers. We can't afford it. We don't have a duty of care, things like that. Yeah. Policy, you hopefully you will take care of people who come on your show, we should do. But we don't have so much set up. But I think that is a problem with us, and we have to sort that out. I know Elon Musk is trying with his community notes, for example, as a sort of... but I wonder if that very policing system or whatever it is at the BBC and at all of these TV channels is what is causing such a grey blob of nothingness, because you just always have to push everything upstairs to the lawyers. And okay, maybe you check it with the fact checkers, they still get stuff wrong. But do you think that is part of the problem? It
could be, although I think it starts much more, in a more fundamental way. People often, your average conservative would always think that when it comes to political bias on the BBC, that it's actually just about, you had 3 Labour people on and only 1 Tory. It's actually not really about that. What it is, it's not just about sort of balance in the kind of debating way. It's what you choose even to cover. So actually bias, political bias, is seen much more, if you like, by omission, in what is not shown, what is not depicted, what's not made into a drama, what is not on in a documentary. So I think it's the people making them, I think, will be, I think they're the problem, actually, more than the lawyers. I think that they push a kind of agenda. I'm not saying anything remotely that most people watching, I think, wouldn't know. I mean, it's just so obvious. And this is why I think fewer and fewer people are watching these channels.
And more are watching our channels.
Well, yes, let's hope.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, it goes to show, doesn't it? To an extent, we're trying to show what we really believe in. And you don't get into this. I mean, you don't get into YouTube because you want to become some sort of billionaire. It's not like founding PayPal or something. I don't know what. You do it because you're saying, there is something really missing on our channels. Yeah. It's just extraordinary that those TV channels don't rectify that by going, maybe we need to actually serve the people watching it.
You would think, wouldn't you? I mean, but the fact is, you see it's not just about technology. You see it in the decline in audiences sort of year on year. I mean, I think that the point is that people know what they're going to get. It's not just with television. It's the same with, I mentioned theatre, but it's the same with movies. I reviewed films for 20 years. And, essentially, you are going to get the same rough message from films, which is a kind of liberal attitude comes through in most films. And after a while, I'm not talking about Marvel here or whatever, but essentially, in films, dramas, and what have you, it will be roughly the same kind of approach. And it's boring, and also it's people feel that they are being lectured, and you used to think, well, I know what I'm going to get. Why would I bother to go and see that? Which is, I think, therefore, to get back to my original point about the arts, and indeed it includes broadcasting, they're sort of, if not careful, they're going to sign their own death warrant. I mean, it's not unlike when you see various actors like we've seen recently, during the American-US campaign. They don't just sort of say, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris, or I don't vote for Trump, and all of that. It's not just. They also sort of manage as well to insult their audience. They manage somehow, they call them, or in not so many words, deplorables, or trash, or any of these things. Robert DeNiro, you can tell, after a while you're thinking, you are, going to kill the goose that's laid your golden egg if you're not careful. People will stop wanting to give you their money.
Yeah.
And I think that might actually be one thing that's happening.
Something insidious about the way those actors do that, because they're so cordoned off in their society of, I was looking at John Cusack just yesterday. He tweeted something just screaming madness on Twitter about the capitalist this and that. The guy's worth $50 million.
Yes, yeah.
And that's not to suggest he's not, because you have money, you're not welcome to an opinion. Of course you are. But as you say, I mean, the way that he seems to hate his own audience,
Yes. Don't insult your audience. It's the classic one. And they sort of do. And, I'm going to leave America now. I'm going to leave because Trump's been elected. These sort of things. People look and think, well, why should I come and see you in something? Why should I come and see you out? Why should I listen to what you have to say? Why should I read your book? Whatever it is.
What are some of the things that the actors, the TV channels, and all of these people are most reluctant to say? What are the most pressing issues?
Well, immigration, of course, which I see as being the top, issue facing this country. Immigration, Islam, Islamist extremism, if you want to make that distinction. And also, I think, as well, the way in which our government is increasingly sort of extra parliament, how basically we increasingly have government by quangocracy, by unelected officials, unelected committees, climate change committee, people like that. That has grown and grown over the past 10 years. And they're all interconnected. But you will get stuff, obviously, on climate change, which is going to obviously, on the TV this is, which obviously is going to be very, very pro the climate change agenda. The idea that you would have some program or documentary which was very, in some ways, sympathetic to, for example, take an elderly couple who see their area change out of all recognition, for example. That's a very, very widespread situation at the moment. And the fact is it would make considerably, important drama, I would say, as well. But the idea that you see something like that, it's just unthinkable. I think it's just that as these things have become far more obviously to the fore, there are more attempts. And this is not a conspiracy, Andrew. It's just there are more attempts to somehow or other play them down, People are very wise to it, I think, now.
I think so. And I guess, okay, so one of the issues you raised there is Islamism, and that's clearly an issue. We talked about, Stacey Dooley's documentary some time ago, couldn't be made now. I've got one more question for you, but where can people find your work? newcultureforum.org.uk. That's our website. And of course, we're on YouTube, New Culture Forum. That's where we are. And I'm on Twitter, @PRWhittle. We'll have all those links below.
Yes, okay.
Tell me who is a heretic you admire.
Heretic I admire. You mean someone who goes against the grain of things? Oh, I'd say Douglas Murray. I think Douglas has performed a major service by writing the great books he's written. actually. And also was, I'd say, far more courageous at a time when many people weren't actually standing up.
Do you think that people might listen more to him than Tommy Robinson, even if they give out some semblance of the same message, just due to class, perhaps?
That's a good question, actually. Would they listen to him more?
Might he make more indents?
I think possibly. Because the thing is that, and I don't mean to be negative about this, but demonstrations are important, protests and demonstrations, but they only take you so far. If you can reach people by a best-selling book, then I think that is, worth its weight in gold.
I think he has had a book out just now, Tommy, which he tweeted as being from prison. I think that's like number one.
Yes.
I don't know. You never know with these number one categories what that really means. But I think a lot of people will be reading it. But yeah, it's something I think about a lot of, and how important it is. Obviously, it's unfair because some people have that education and some don't. But how to be a good orator, to be able to speak well, whether that's Obama or Trump. I mean, Trump speaks well. In a roundabout way.
You mean it's important for anyone? It absolutely is. I think what's gone against Tommy Robinson, which is the most disgraceful reason, is he's working class.
Yeah,
and I think that basically they are working class people in Britain now are the most demonized. There's almost nothing you can't say about them. And essentially, we've seen the re-emergence, or maybe it was always there, of outright snobbery, right? And you see it. Well, we've talked about the deplorables and the garbage. It was the American people were called by the Democrats. You've had the same sort of thing here. I was very heavily involved in the Brexit campaign, and anyone will tell you. I mean, basically, people who vote Brexit, bigots, you racists, you're thick. We've got college degrees. How many college degrees have you got? It literally came down to that.
Pathetic. Pathetic. Journalists, the most over-educated, journalists like us, I suppose, most over-educated profession, all the college degrees.
Well, yes, but also college degrees doesn't mean what it once did anyway. It just means actually you've had basically you've been through the indoctrination process.
Yeah, and box ticking as well. You're a box ticker. With Tommy Robinson, I think there's no vindication at any point because he said this was happening. He said there was one mosque in Luton when he was a kid, and there are now 40.
Yes,
and there's no point where people go, you know what, mate, fair enough. You were right. Let's listen.
Yeah,
he just gets thrown in prison. Perhaps rightly. I don't know I don't quite understand the full details of why, or But
this recent one,
yes.
Oh no, that's undoubtedly true. I mean, I think the thing is that, very little is open to ordinary people when it comes to protesting and making their voices felt about these very fundamental things. Very little is actually open to them. And, I think that it is, with Tommy Robinson, undoubtedly, he's been demonized, to the extent that I think people just simply call him racist or whatever. It seems to me that all his concerns have been about basically Islam, right? But he's, so that's quite distinct. I don't see him as being racist. You interviewed him.
I searched long and hard because I knew I'd get criticism, and I thought I need to make sure to take him to task a little bit because he was, when I was growing up, basically the face of racist evil. That's what I thought. So I thought there must be something. There was one video I was able to find actually after I'd interviewed where he used a sort of the shortened Pakistani word that we see as a slur here. And other than that, absolutely certainly nothing ideological or in terms of a manifesto. I'm sure he's probably used horrible nicknames and things about all other kinds of people because that's the kind of life he grew up in. It was around a lot. He was into his sort of boxing clubs and these kinds of pubby kind of scene that I wasn't really, I don't know much about. But I found nothing to suggest that he saw different races as lower or more inferior to him. Everything was the belief system of Islam. So...
Yes, I think, as I said, I mean, to repeat myself, I think that you can utterly demonize working class people now, and on not just on that subject, but on a whole host of other subjects. I mean, we talked about multiculturalism earlier. I do think that for multiculturalism to work, it had to have a kind of common enemy. And in some ways, it was the working class people who were sort of became the de facto enemy.
I think that's a great point. People, please go and follow the New Culture Forum. Peter Whittle, the links will be down below. He's a wonderful guest, so make sure you do go over and do all of those things. Hit that like button and keep watching this show as well.